George Foreman has 12 children, 5 sons and 7 daughters. And every single one of his sons has the same name, George Edward Foreman. George Jr., George III, George IV, George V, and George VI. When people ask him why, he usually jokes about getting hit in the head too many times to remember different names. But the real reason is something he didn't talk about for decades. Something that haunted him from the age of 5 until the day he became a father himself. This is the story of a boy who didn't know his father's name, who spent his childhood looking for a man who never existed, and who grew up to give his sons the one thing he never had, a father whose name they could carry with pride. 5th Ward, Houston, Texas. 1954. George Foreman was 5 years old when he asked his mother the question that would define the rest of his childhood. They were sitting in their tiny house, 7 children crammed into 3 rooms, and George had just come home from school where a teacher had asked every child to stand up and say their father's name. George couldn't answer. He didn't know his father's name. He didn't even know who his father was. "Mama," he said, looking up at Nancy Foreman. "Who's my daddy?" Nancy Foreman was a strong woman. She had to be. Single mother of 7 children in one of the poorest, most dangerous neighborhoods in America in the 1950s. She worked multiple jobs, cleaned houses, did laundry, anything to feed her kids. But George's question made her pause, made her put down the pot she was stirring and kneel down to look at her son. "Your daddy's name is Leroy Moorhead," she said quietly. "But he's not around anymore. He left before you were born." "Why?" George asked. "Why did he leave?" Nancy didn't have a good answer. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that his father didn't want him? That before George even took his first breath, his father had decided he wasn't worth staying for? So she did what parents do when they don't know what to say. She changed the subject. But the question didn't go away. It grew. It festered. It became the central mystery of George Foreman's childhood. Who was Leroy Moorhead? What did he look like? Did George look like him? Did he have his eyes, his nose, his walk, his voice? For years, George would walk through the 5th Ward looking at men's faces. Every man he passed could be his father. The guy on the corner selling newspapers. The man coming out of the bar. The preacher at church. The postman delivering mail. George would study their features, searching for some resemblance, some clue that would tell him, "That's him. That's my father." He'd see a tall man and think, "Maybe that's why I'm tall." He'd see a man with broad shoulders and think, "Maybe that's where I get my strength." Every physical characteristic George had, he tried to trace back to a man who might be watching him from a distance, a man who knew George was his son but chose to stay away. The not knowing was torture. It wasn't just curiosity. It was deeper than that. It was a fundamental question about his own existence. Who am I? Where do I come from? Do I matter? When George was 7, Nancy married a man named J.D. Foreman. J.D. wasn't George's biological father, but he gave George his last name. Finally, George Foreman had a complete name. But having a name didn't fill the hole inside him. J.D. was a hard man, not cruel, but distant. He worked long hours and didn't have much patience for children who weren't his own blood. George went from having no father to having a father who was there but not really there. School became George's battleground. Teachers would call roll. "George Foreman!" And George would raise his hand, but inside he'd be thinking, "That's not really my name. My name should be George Moorhead. But I don't know what Moorhead means because I never met him." Other kids had fathers who came to school events. George would watch them, these men who showed up for their sons, and feel a jealousy so intense it made his chest hurt. He'd see a boy hug his father and wonder what that felt like. To have a man you could call dad. A man who chose to stay. By the time George was 13, the anger had built up so much that it started coming out in violence. He joined a street gang. Not because he believed in what they stood for, but because they gave him something he'd never had, a group where he belonged, where nobody asked about his father, where his identity was simple. He was George, and he was tough, and that was enough. The gang fights, the robberies, the violence, it was all George trying to prove something. Trying to prove he existed. Trying to prove he mattered. Trying to fill the space where a father should have been with anything that would fit. At 15, George dropped out of school. He was big for his age, over 6 feet tall, and strong. He got a job doing construction, but he spent most of his money on himself, on clothes and shoes that would make him look important. Because inside, he still felt like nothing. Like a boy without a name. Without a father. Without an identity. Then in 1965, something changed. George saw a commercial on television for the Job Corps, a government program that trained young people for careers. The commercial showed young men learning skills, getting educations, making something of themselves. And George thought, maybe that's how I find out who I am. Maybe if I learn a skill, if I become somebody, I'll finally know who George Foreman is. He joined the Job Corps and was sent to Oregon. Away from Houston. Away from the Fifth Ward. Away from the streets where he'd spent years looking for a ghost. And in Oregon, George Foreman learned to box. Boxing was different from street fighting. In street fights, you just swung wild, trying to hurt someone before they hurt you. In boxing, there was technique, strategy, discipline, and something else, identity. When you're a boxer, people call you by your name. George Foreman, step into the ring. Your name matters. Your identity matters. George was good at boxing. Better than good. He was powerful, aggressive, relentless. Within a year, he was winning amateur tournaments. Within 2 years, he was training for the Olympics. And in 1968, at 19 years old, George Foreman won the Olympic gold medal in Mexico City. Standing on that podium, with the gold medal around his neck, George felt something he'd never felt before. Pride. Not just in winning, but in his name. Gold medalist, George Foreman. It was in the newspapers. On television. People knew who George Foreman was. But even with the gold medal, even with the fame, the hole was still there. Because George still didn't know who he really was. He was George Foreman, Olympic champion. But who was George Foreman, the person? Where did he come from? Who was his father? He turned professional in 1969 and started destroying opponents. Joe Frazier, the heavyweight champion, beaten in 2 rounds. Ken Norton, beaten in 2 rounds. George Foreman became heavyweight champion of the world in 1973, and the world feared him. They called him the hardest puncher in boxing history. They said he was unstoppable. But George knew the truth. He was still that 5-year-old boy asking his mother, "Who's my daddy?" He was still walking through life looking at men's faces, wondering if one of them was Leroy Moorhead. He was still trying to fill a hole that couldn't be filled with championships or money or fame. Then came Muhammad Ali and the Rumble in the Jungle in 1974. Ali beat George, knocked him down for the first time in his life, took his championship. And George felt like that little boy again. Worthless. Without identity. Without purpose. The years after that were dark. George kept boxing, but his heart wasn't in it. He was going through the motions. And then in 1977, after losing to Jimmy Young in Puerto Rico, George had his near-death experience. His heart stopped. And in that darkness, George Foreman met God. Or at least that's how he described it later. He had a revelation. An understanding of something he'd been missing his entire life. The revelation wasn't about boxing. It wasn't about championships. It was about identity. In that moment between life and death, George understood something profound. He'd spent 28 years trying to find his father so he could know who he was. But he'd been looking in the wrong place. His identity wasn't in Leroy Moorhead. His identity was in himself, in the man he chose to be. George retired from boxing and became a preacher. He started a church and a youth center. He worked with kids from the Fifth Ward, kids just like him. Kids without fathers. Kids without identities. Kids looking for something to fill the hole inside them. And George told them the truth he'd learned. You don't need a father to tell you who you are. You choose who you are. But the real transformation came when George became a father himself. His first son was born in 1983. George held this tiny baby in his massive hands, hands that had knocked out champions, and he felt something break open inside him. This child was his son, his blood. And this child would never have to ask, "Who's my daddy?" This child would always know. They named the baby George Edward Foreman Jr. When his second son was born in 1984, George and his wife Mary Joan were discussing names. Mary Joan suggested several options: Michael, David, James. But George kept coming back to one name: George. "We already have a George," Mary Joan said. "I want another George," George said. "Why?" And that's when George finally said out loud what he'd been carrying for 35 years. "Because I want my sons to never wonder who their father is. I want them to carry my name so they always know they belong to me. So they never feel like I felt. So they never have to look at strangers and wonder if that's their dad. They'll look at their name and they'll know exactly who their father is." Mary Joan understood. She saw the pain in her husband's eyes. The little boy who'd never healed from not having a father. So their second son became George Edward Foreman III. When their third son was born in 1987, there was no discussion: George Edward Foreman IV. When the fourth son arrived in 1989, George Edward Foreman V. And when the fifth son was born in 1993, George Edward Foreman VI. 5 sons. 5 George. All carrying their father's name like a badge of honor. Like proof that they belonged somewhere. To someone. But George didn't stop there. His daughters, all 7 of them, carried variations of his name too. Georgetta. Frida George. More George. The Foreman household became a house full of George. And people thought it was eccentric. Funny even. Late-night talk show hosts made jokes about it. "George Foreman has so many kids named George, he has to use numbers like a king." But George never laughed at those jokes. Because for him, it wasn't funny. It was sacred. Every time he called one of his children's names, every time he said, "George," he was healing something inside himself. He was rewriting his childhood. He was giving his children what he never had. As the boys grew up, people would ask them how they felt about all having the same name. Didn't it get confusing? Didn't they want their own identity? And each of them said the same thing: "We love it. We love carrying our father's name. We know exactly who we are. We're George Foreman's sons." George Jr., the oldest, understood it best. When he was a teenager, he asked his father directly, "Dad, why did you name all of us George?" They were sitting in George's office at the church. George looked at his son, this young man who had his face, his build, his smile, and he told him the truth. The whole truth. About being 5 years old and not knowing his father's name. About walking through the Fifth Ward looking at strangers' faces. About feeling like he didn't exist because he didn't know where he came from. About the hole that nothing could fill until he finally understood that his identity wasn't in his father, but in himself. "And then you were born," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I realized I had the power to give you something I never had. I could give you an identity that was undeniable. When someone asks you who your father is, you don't have to wonder. You don't have to look for him. You just look at your name. George Foreman, Jr. That tells you everything you need to know. You're mine. You belong to me. You matter. George Jr. was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm proud to be your son, Dad. I'm proud to carry your name. And George Foreman, the man who'd knocked out Joe Frazier, who'd terrified the boxing world, who'd come back at 45 to become champion, cried. Because his son understood. His son got it. The name wasn't about ego. It was about love. It was about belonging. It was about making sure his children never felt the pain he felt. Over the years, each of George's sons came to understand the gift their father had given them. Not just a name, but an identity. A place in the world. A father who claimed them proudly, who never disappeared, who never made them wonder if they mattered. George III became a businessman. George IV became an entrepreneur. George V went into ministry. George VI pursued his own path. And all of them, every single one, carried the name George Foreman with pride. Not as a burden. Not as confusion. But as a declaration. I know who I am. I know where I come from. I know I'm loved. The daughters felt it too. Georgetta would later say in an interview, My father gave us his name because his name means something to him. It means love. It means commitment. It means I'm here and I'm not leaving. When you grow up with a father who makes sure you never doubt that you're wanted, it changes everything. But there was one more chapter to George's story about names and identity. One more healing that needed to happen. In 2009, when George was 60 years old, he decided to do something he'd never done before. He decided to find Leroy Moorhead, his biological father. It took private investigators and months of searching, but they found him. Leroy Moorhead was living in Texas, not far from Houston. He was in his 80s, living in a nursing home. George drove there with George Jr., his oldest son. Walking into that nursing home, George felt like that 5-year-old boy again. His heart was racing. His hands were shaking. After 60 years of wondering, he was about to meet the man who'd given him life, but hadn't given him a name. The man he'd looked for in strangers' faces. The man who'd left before George was born. Leroy Moorhead was sitting in a wheelchair in the common room. He was old, frail, nothing like the figure George had imagined in his childhood. George walked up to him with George Jr. beside him. Mr. Moorhead? George said. The old man looked up. His eyes were cloudy, his face weathered. Yes. My name is George Foreman. I'm your son. For a long moment, Leroy just stared. Then recognition flickered across his face. Not recognition of George, but recognition of the situation. He knew why George was there. I heard you became somebody, Leroy said quietly. Boxer. Champion. Yes, sir, George said. But I didn't come here to talk about boxing. I came here because I spent my whole childhood wondering who you were. I spent 60 years with a hole inside me because I didn't have a father. And I needed to see you. I needed to know why you left. Leroy looked down at his hands. I was young. Scared. Your mama was a good woman, but I wasn't ready to be a father. I didn't know how. George felt the anger he'd carried for 6 decades start to rise. All those years of pain. All those years of wondering. All those years of feeling like he wasn't worth staying for. And the reason was, I wasn't ready. But then George looked at George Jr. standing beside him. His son. His namesake. The boy who'd never had to wonder who his father was. And George realized something. He didn't need Leroy Moorhead's explanation. He didn't need his apology. He didn't need anything from this old man in a wheelchair. Because George had already healed the wound. Not by finding his father, but by being a father. By making sure his own children never felt what he felt. By giving them his name. By claiming them. By staying. "Mr. Moorhead," George said, and his voice was calm now. "I forgive you. I forgive you for leaving. I forgive you for not being there. I forgive you because I don't need you to be my father anymore. I figured out who I am without you. And I made sure my children would never have to figure it out like I did." He gestured to George Jr. "This is my son, George Foreman Jr. I have 4 more sons, all named George, and 7 daughters who carry my name too. They all know who their father is. They'll never have to wonder. They'll never have to look at strangers' faces searching for themselves. That's what you gave me, Mr. Moorhead. You gave me the gift of knowing what not to do. And I'm grateful for that." Leroy Moorhead had tears running down his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry." "I know," George said. "And I forgive you." George and George Jr. left the nursing home that day, and George felt lighter than he felt in his entire life. The 5-year-old boy who'd asked, "Who's my daddy?" was finally at peace. Not because he found his biological father, but because he'd become the father he'd always needed. Leroy Moorhead died 6 months later. George went to the funeral. He paid for it, actually. And at the service, George stood up and said something that shocked everyone there. "Leroy Moorhead gave me life," George said. "But he also gave me purpose. Because his absence taught me what presence means. His leaving taught me what staying means. And his inability to be a father taught me how to be the father I always needed. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful for what I learned from what he didn't give me." Today, George Foreman is 75 years old. His children are grown. His grandchildren are growing up. And when people ask him about naming all his sons George, he still tells the joke about getting hit in the head too many times. But if you press him, if you ask him the real reason, he'll get quiet for a moment. And then he'll say this: "I named my sons George because I wanted them to know they belonged to me. I wanted them to carry my name with pride. I wanted them to never wonder who their father was or if he loved them. I wanted to give them the one thing I never had, an identity that couldn't be taken away. When you're George Foreman's son, named George Foreman, you know exactly who you are. You're loved. You're claimed. You're mine. And you always will be." That's the secret behind the name. That's why 5 boys carry the name George. That's why 7 girls carry variations of it. It's not ego. It's not eccentricity. It's love. It's healing. It's a father making sure his children never feel the pain he felt. It's a man rewriting his childhood through his children's lives. George Foreman never knew his father, but his children will never not know theirs. They carry his name. They carry his love. They carry proof that they matter, that they belong, that they're wanted. And in giving them that gift, George Foreman finally healed a wound that had been bleeding since he was 5 years old. The little boy who asked, "Who's my daddy?" became the man who made sure his children would never have to ask. He became the father he needed. And he gave his children something priceless, an identity, a belonging, and a name that means, "I love you, I claim you, I'm here, and I'm not leaving." That's why all 5 sons are named George. That's the secret. That's the healing. That's the love that breaks generational curses and rewrites family stories. George Foreman didn't just become a champion in the ring. He became a champion at breaking cycles, at healing wounds, and at making sure the next generation would carry a name that meant something beautiful: Father. If this story of identity, healing, and breaking generational curses moved you, remember that the greatest victory you'll ever achieve isn't in what you accomplish. It's in what you give to the next generation. It's in making sure your children never carry the wounds you carried. George Foreman couldn't change his childhood, But he changed his children's childhood. And that's the greatest comeback of all.